Welcome to the Stoa. The Stoa is a digital campfire where we cohere and dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now.
In particular, I think that the situational awareness of organizations is taken for granted when it's actually a really remarkable thing. Individuals can make sense of circumstances, individuals can act. How in the world can information flow in an organization of dozens, hundreds, or thousands of people in a timely manner? Especially flow on subjects that were never predicted in the first place, were never built or baked into the structure. Now, I'm not here saying that, something like a natural disaster or the exact course of a battle or the exact course of events in an industrial accident aren't things that are physically predictable. They certainly are. But when people set up bureaucratic structures, they, by default, can't foresee all the circumstances. There are too many cases. Where's the special form for, the world is ending. Can you delay my taxes by 4 months? Like, there's no form like that. It would be ridiculous to have a form like that. So whatever, when the end of the world comes, which this is not, this is merely, this is another historical plague. The COVID influenza is, no worse than any of those big historical events have been. It's not even as bad as the influenza of 1918. However, if the end of the world were to come, people instantly, in a bureaucracy even, would jump from bureaucratic coordination, where you read the piece of paper in front of you, you pursue the narrow task at hand, to something more informal, right? There would be some designated, perhaps, chain of command if it's a hierarchical organization, or there might be something like extraordinary working groups set up that had the authority to deal with this specific issue. So something that's outside the hierarchy. So the two mechanisms at play, one is much more hierarchical, military in nature, where essentially for unforeseen circumstances, you pass the buck up the chain of command. So this would be how, in a military situation, if there are no standing orders, a unit might request for further instructions, just going up the chain all the way to the theoretical, commander of the battlefield. Now, different militaries do this in different ways. There are different philosophies of command, and these have changed a lot through the 19th and 20th century. The key puzzle people try to solve is, how to reduce the decision burden at higher and higher levels of command, because micromanaging the battlefield like a real-time strategy game is simply impossible. Even today with digital technologies, you could possibly just jump into any corner of the battlefield and see what's happening there via camera, audio, and so on. But you're still a single person, you're still a single mind. You can't make all of these tiny decisions all over the place. Even with something like information processing, such as machine learning, I think it's actually constrained by some of the same features that constrain bureaucratic reasoning. All artificial intelligence systems today that are in wide use rely on big data. They rely on a vast training set of examples to make sense of situations, and often give anomalous and anomalously bad advice or outcomes in fringe situations. The reason that an artificial intelligence can beat a master Go player today is because it can play billions, if not trillions, of games against itself. Every edge case suddenly is not this rare unitary event, but something with thousands, tens of thousands, millions of instances of that exact case playing out in various minute details and variants. A bureaucracy is best suited to dealing with something that happens 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 times in a year. It is worse suited to deal with something that happens once a year, or even worse, something that happens once every 50 years. An artificial intelligence is actually, in a way, worse. It's very good at dealing with something that happens 1,000 or 10,000 times per second. Now, because of this, even on the modern battlefield, the artificial intelligence, while helpful, can't necessarily make sense of everything that's happening, nor can a general make sense of everything that's happening. So since, I think this was early 20th century, or actually, no, I think it's 19th century, the Prussian general staff and modern descended militaries have had this directive. You have an overriding objective as a local commander. We won't tell you how to do it. You are just empowered to do whatever is necessary, right? So there are, in fact, then a chain not just of strict obedience of orders, but a chain of judgment calls going up the hierarchy. And then the quality of that chain of judgment calls, whether I defer this up or whether I attempt to solve it myself, and how exactly do I solve it, then depends on the quality of the people in the chain. And that's inescapable. No process, no procedure is going to abate that. Now, in non-military contexts, you often have a very similar situation, such as the organization of the people who were helping to build the big concrete sarcophagus that now exists around the Chernobyl power plant. Can I just have a show of hands of if people know what I'm talking about, people know enough about the Chernobyl disaster? Okay, okay. Well, in that case, I'll just summarize it in one sentence, but I'm glad everyone knows. Basically, Chernobyl power plant was a nuclear power plant meltdown in the 1980s. And one of the efforts to help deal with the disaster was simply bury the whole thing under concrete. However, this open reactor with an open nuclear fire, right? It was just a fire. It was constantly emitting radioactive particles as the reactor itself had melted down. It was very hazardous work, especially initially. And it was hazardous, up to the point of many of the people working on it dying. Some were volunteers, some were ordered to do it. It was an improvised group. It wasn't just a military group. But during that period of work where every command or judgment call might mean another worker is dead or another worker lives, one becomes, a hero of the Soviet Union after death, and the other one might enjoy their medal. Enjoy. That in that situation, they had this chain of judgment calls locally, right? Now, I've described in detail the sort of chain of command structure, this kind of military structure and logic. I tried to sketch out an argument for why I think artificial intelligence does not remove the need for it, because it's bad at dealing at outlier events. So we have to maintain human judgment there. Now let's talk about informal working group. Now let's talk about working groups. Organizations can sometimes achieve situational awareness because they understand that, no, actually, even if we have good judgment calls, even if our processes were somehow sufficient, we just are not built for this. Yet our organization as a whole is expected to do something about this. And in that case, you go through your entire staff. You don't necessarily think about seniority. You don't necessarily, think about what the normal channels of command are, and you build a parallel structure. If you are very lucky, and if you're operating in a culture of high integrity and honesty, you can appoint something like a committee to truly solve a problem. But as we know, the federal government or any corporate organization is filled with committees and subcommittees that function more as reputation laundering factories, these like avoid responsibility rather than taking actions. But the reason it's littered with committees is the following. The failure case demonstrates the use case. An organization is expected to do something that its normal bureaucratic structures, hierarchical structures do not handle. The leadership either does not wish to handle it or wishes to handle it and says, this is not a normal problem. We're going to resort to extraordinary means. We're going to have an investigative committee into this, or we're going to have a committee deal with it. And then that committee is composed allegedly on the basis of expertise. So in an interesting way, in a deep sociological sense, the chain of command and hierarchy is implicitly resting on individual authority. Meanwhile, the committee structure rests implicitly on knowledge, right? Supposedly technical expertise. Sometimes disinterest if we go all the way to a legal court, but that's not really necessary. You can have an interested committee. The committee might be called a board, for example, right? It would be silly if a board had no stake in the company it was managing. So there's, in fact, variation, interest versus disinterest. So if I would say the true fundamental claim there is knowledge, and that there is, of course, a distinction between knowledge and judgment, right? Knowledge can be held collectively. I think judgment cannot be held collectively. It comes up to being a single mind's decision eventually. Now, there are some interesting prerequisites for making committees work. I think that they require a high degree of professionalism, where by professionalism, I don't mean just a code of etiquette. When you go see your doctor, you're not Bob and the doctor is not Alice. You are the patient and the doctor is a doctor. And all of us know how that interaction is supposed to look. To a lesser extent, we all know how a relationship between a client and a lawyer work, right? The reason is not because we intricately it's not because we intricately understand the detail of them as human beings. It's because we understand what a functional social role is supposed to be. Now, the social role might not be quite as functional, but we understand what it's supposed to look like. It could be that in a society, the relation between doctor and patient is, it's dysfunctional. Perhaps it causes a lot of misdiagnosis or something. However, everyone in this society understands how to play those roles. Now, there should be an understanding that if you are appointed to investigate something extraordinary, professionalism and your LARP expects you, there's a LARP in this, right? The doctor is LARP being short for live action role play. You are role playing that you are not Alice and not Bob, rather you are a doctor and a patient. You don't need to understand the intricate details of each other to interact and get the business of the day done. And I think for a committee member, well, when they're wearing their hat as the committee member and this body has been assembled temporarily or permanently to make decisions, you have to actually not think of your interests in the old hierarchy and the old bureaucratic process, where bureaucratic process is, again, this breaking down of tasks of a complicated world into a series of simple scripts, right? One way to think of a highly bureaucratized environment is that it's almost a piece of software where pieces of code are executed by all the individuals stacked neatly into a role. A lot of things we might think of as non-bureaucratic are actually bureaucratic. For example, the assembly line, highly bureaucratic in this usage of the word, because when I put in the door and the car rolls a little bit further and someone puts in the windows into the door, I don't think or necessarily know everything about the construction of the car. I know what my job is, and I do that part. I'm not taking responsibility as a craftsman would to build the entire car. It's much more economical for me to just take responsibility for, I will put this door in. Now, whether the car is any good, whether the assembly line is efficient, that's really not my problem. In a similar way, I'm just filling out the A40 form, and whether my federal agency or my company are doing the right thing or doing well, in a sense, that's not really my responsibility. So one has to exit that mindset. So if you're pulled from the assembly line or pulled from the bureaucratic structure and placed into such a body, you suddenly have to be proactively investigating, seeking knowledge, and presenting it to fellow committee members to reach an actual decision. That's the first prerequisite. This professionalism is very emotionally and intellectually challenging because it puts you out of the default role. Secondly, the functionality has to be at the peak of the organization, where the existing structure mustn't see any decision you reach as illegitimate. The body has to, both in theory and practice, have decision-making ability, and whatever the internal structure of this organization is, be it government, non-government, organized religion, it has to be tolerant of that decision-making process. Now, this is easier said than done, right? You might have, say, a government where you create a consultative body, and before you know it, the consultative body has the real power and you've been removed from power. Most people in power will avoid this outcome. Some very far-sighted people might decide this is a good outcome because they fear that they will fail succession problem. If I'm being a little flippant and if I'm simplifying it a little bit, the evolution of the English Parliament was very much like this: a consultative body becoming a true legislative body, becoming eventually a ruling body with even executive powers being vested in the hands of a new office, prime minister, selected from among parliamentarians. Now, of course, the prime ministerial office itself is no longer a committee, but still, committees are these very powerful objects, partially because they can make sense of unusual circumstances. They can be hollowed out in a second way. So one of them is being overridden by an existing power structure. The other one is bureaucratization, where instead of it being, say, if you inflate the committee massively, it is, in terms of social technology, basically the same thing as a Senate or as a Congress or as a parliament. In a smaller size, it could be a group of 4 or 5 friends behind a table making sense of things. It gets harder and harder to manage and keep functional the larger it is, but with additional social technologies such as expectation of public honesty, such as investment in direct persuasive ability rather than persuasion of the audience, you can scale it to maybe 100 people or maybe even 200 people. We need to understand that, the parliaments and congresses of the 19th and 18th century were not like the congresses and parliaments of today. It was essentially 200 of the country's most powerful and wealthy people gathered in a room deciding what to do. One would make a speech, and the speech would not persuade the country, it would persuade the other congressmen. When's the last time that you saw a congressman in the US change their vote on the basis of either rhetoric or a logical argument delivered on, the floor? I think it's not been in our lifetimes, but it did once exist, and perhaps existed at a higher level in British Parliament than it did in French parliamentarism, or possibly even the later Congresses of the US. It certainly was there for the original Continental Congress and, for the gathering in Philadelphia, when the Constitution was set up. All of these things that today are read as these, intellectual artifact, the Federalist Papers, the Anti-Federalist Papers, all of that stuff, that was just part of practical political debate. Can you imagine anything of substance coming out of practical political debate between Republicans and Democrats today? And even the fact that there are Republicans and Democrats shows something interesting. It shows that you have perhaps a poorly functioning, but a hierarchical command and control structure that determines the vote. In this sense, it's debatable whether Congress even is a true committee in the sense that I was talking about committees earlier. So bureaucratization, proceduralization, and new hierarchies can overrule the committee body, can cause it dysfunction, can disassemble it. So you have to allow for it. Now, dealing with disasters, we then have always the suspension of bureaucracy, followed by a chain of judgment if it's highly functional, and a chain of merely controlling action if it's a little bit dysfunctional, so a hierarchical structure. We can have a committee, and there is a third option. Yes, there is a third option. The third option is a relatively high trust environment with informal social ties. These can, of course, be used for corruption. Corruption, we might mean not following the rules. But the difference in not following the rules when it's corruption and when it's common sense is merely in whether it's good or judged good by society at large or by the interests of the organization. Ideally, both, right? It's both legal, it's moral, and it's good for the organization. If you are harassed for violating the rules in such a way that is morally good, practically good, and good for the organization, I think that's more corrupt almost than being simply forgiven. And of course, after the fact, the rules should be changed to account for this, to make it more legible to others and to not provide a cover for, action that's essentially antisocial. I think that final step of a high trust culture where there are friendships all over the hierarchy, all over these proceduralized assembly lines of paper, all over these sometimes functioning and non-functioning committees, represents an actually distributed network of information sharing, and yes, also influence, and is in a way this most natural human organizing system, right? We've always lived in tribes. We've always been a social species. We know how far gossip can travel. Now it seems gossip mostly travels about, where the mates are and where the food is, but we've applied that to many diverse circumstances. So, despite these impulses perhaps originally evolving for very primitive needs, they can have very sophisticated application. But this network is as good at bypassing functioning things as it is at bypassing dysfunctional things. Say the biggest enemy of the secrecy of the Manhattan Project during World War II was in fact precisely not any targeted process of infiltration by, say, the Soviet government or the Nazi government. The biggest enemy was simply people like to talk to their friends about what they're doing and what's going wrong and what's going right. And there are people who know that you have to listen when dissatisfied employees go around and discuss what's going on. So this sort of rumor mill and rumor spread was what was most easily picked up by intelligence agents from Germany. It was much harder to just have an embedded agent in the project, though that's certainly possible, right? The Soviets achieved this in one or two examples. So yeah, situational awareness can be achieved through these three methods. And now I'm looking forward to the questions.
Very cool. So if you have a question for Samo, just write it in the chat box. Indicate if you want me to read it on your behalf. I'll warm up Samo with a few questions myself. So what came to mind is this, how you ended this really good article you wrote in the American Mind. And I'm going to read it, the last paragraph. The time has come in America once again for heroism. Don't worry about credentials or prestige. Don't worry about party affiliation. Find the brave and the smart and hand them the keys to the ignition as fast as you can. Your boss can fire them later if need be. And yes, maybe he will fire you too. Who can afford to care about job security in a plague? Love it. And yeah, so I just want, maybe if, do you have any additional thoughts on that? And I have a question to follow up.
Well, that article is nearly a month old. And at the start of the article, I was, unfortunately, there's a less elated, a less positive, a less, interesting line where I said that in a few months, there will be tens of thousands of dead Americans. And some people who read this are like, Sam, are you really comfortable making that prediction? And I very much was comfortable making that prediction. So I had assumed the hierarchical structure of the CDC had failed. I had assumed that the executive structure of the US had failed. So it was not, the presidency was not going to effectively handle an extraordinary situation, though arguably that's one of its functions. I certainly was not expecting intervention at a government or non-government level. So the fastest intervention that can work with a 6-day doubling time, right? Even though, of course, in the wild, an exponential is never an exponential. It's always broken by some things, right? I still think, the doubling time of 6 days was very instructive. In optimal conditions, you might have it, the number of infected might be doubled every 6 days. In such circumstances, I don't think bringing together committees or the informal network of influence and information are fast enough. So what I thought should be done is individuals should be appointed just with the authority to handle this specific issue and no other. And rules should be suspended so they can do what need be and bring together whichever agencies need to be brought together to do particular steps to do things such as, if it's the right move to acquire a lot of ventilators, do that. And one of the requirements for such a person to have good judgment was actually an overlap of good judgment and knowledge, right? So they actually have to be knowledgeable, right? They have to be smart and brave, because timidity, I think, is like one of the great curses of people with knowledge, especially today, because in many ways there is a negative selection for it, right? Sometimes in many positions throughout, say, government and society today, being strategically ignorant of what is inconvenient to know actually reduces your organization's liability, right? So that needed to be like firmly bypassed because in the US, perhaps more similar to China than would be comfortable, testing was not readily available. And perhaps it was, a disaster. Perhaps it simply was that no one was prepared, or simply they didn't want the numbers to be too high, at least at first. They didn't want to panic people. And I think the second interpretation, that they just didn't want to panic people and were downplaying it by limiting the testing, I think that's quite plausible.
Hmm. And the word that was really salient for me was heroism. And then your distinction about live player, dead player came to mind as well. And I really love that distinction. So maybe you could elaborate what that means. And when I feel into that and reflect on that distinction, virtue comes to mind. Because as you know, Stoicism is about living a life of virtue. So maybe you can kind of elaborate on what that distinction is, and maybe how being a live player relates to being virtuous.
Well, the distinction I introduced in one of my articles between, live and dead players is the distinction between someone that is following a script, a preset pattern of behavior, and someone that is adapting actively, that is adapting creatively to completely new circumstances they've never encountered. A dead player, in a strategic sense, might be an individual or organization that, however highly effective, has this limited repertoire of responses. A live player will attempt things, sometimes in a very costly way, that have never been done before. So you might have, a highly effective dead player, a simple script of moves on the chessboard that you are supposed to take, if-then sentences, essentially. And a live player might still be relatively bad at winning a chess game against such an automated system or scripted player. But live players become, over the long term, the most robust to change, because unpredicted things always happen. Narrow optimizations are revealed to be narrow. So stuff that lasts longer, individuals that adapt more dynamically to disruptions, that's sort of in the direction of live players. Now, for an individual to be a live player, I think it requires several virtues. One of the things is bravery, where I think one of the basic flaws of human thinking is that we often don't want to know that we don't know. We are often afraid of changes, unpredictability, risks. A live player consciously understands risks and undertakes those risks. If you ever feel that you are completely safe in a way, not in a deep philosophical, but just in a practical way, completely insulated from financial, interpersonal, health risks, it's very likely that you're overloaded on risk. It's likelier that you're not paying conscious attention to all the ways in which you are risk taking, and are pushing that into the background, out of awareness. If your control panel, all the lights are blinking green, there are two possibilities. One is everything is well, and the other one is your control panel is broken, right? And it's the case that there seems to be some type of self-deception here, and it can be addressed partially through bravery, through sort of not being afraid of realities as they exist, if I emphasize the virtue there. Another one might be self-honesty, again, where you don't focus on the gains that, fortunately or unfortunately, being strategically ignorant can bring you, and you choose to embrace knowledge, even when somewhat costly. And I think number 3 would be being capable of living in society without being that constrained by societal norms. Let me explain. Following the inner logic of the societal norms rather than the letter. So the spirit rather than the letter of the social, interpersonal, moral, societal, political, religious law of whatever society you happen to find yourself in. Because the fact is, if you are incapable of doing that, right? If you're incapable of mostly following that spirit, and you follow the letter, you can still live fine. But if you are incapable of following the letter, whether or not the letter is correct, the rest of society does punish you, right? So, I think it's Aristotle said that uh, anyone who lives alone is either beast or God, right? So we all live in society. We're mostly people. Not most of us have not, ascended to godhood or, go on to become a beast, a solitary creature. And because of that, we have to have a way to deal with the rest of society, whether it's right or wrong. And ideally, we understand the positive spirit behind what can be done rather than merely follow rules. But if we don't understand the spirit, following the rules is what allows us to live together. Hopefully that answers your question. It was a good question, I think.
Yeah, it answers it nicely. And it maps over the cardinal virtues with any Stoic worth his salt would follow. So, Daniel, if you can unmute yourself and ask Samo your question.
Yeah, I'm still processing what you just said, because I'm starting to think that to some extent, due to social isolation, people have been pushed one or two notches closer to the beast or the God end of the spectrum. And my question has something to do with that. I feel there's maybe this latent potential energy in society right now that doesn't really know where it needs to go. I framed it based on what you said earlier. When you force people to work from home, this partially breaks the myth of their roles and their professionalism, and it reduces our LARPing tendencies. So I guess just generally, what sort of opportunities do you see emerging from that?
I think what I would be most hopeful of is a culture of I will do what I can do, and I will be acknowledged for doing what I can do, where we go one click away from proceduralized distribution of tasks, where it's my job to put the door in the car, and it doesn't matter if the car already has an engine or not, to I'm taking responsibility for not necessarily the whole car, but the safety of this door. And I'm also taking responsibility for spotting what is wrong, if anything is wrong, and going to talk to the engine guys and ask them, should we stop the assembly line? There seems to be no engine in this car. I think our society is too mechanistic and too bureaucratized overall, the way it's currently structured, for us to go more than a few clicks in the direction of personal judgment and responsibility taking, where I have to say something. When I say responsibility taking, I'm not saying that it's always upon the individual to take responsibility. I'm also saying we need a society that can accept an individual's claim to responsibility and respect it, right? Without that part, we can do all the inner psychological work that we want, have all the virtue we want, but still the virtue comes to be punished, essentially, either through lack of opportunity or through just even more active measures, right? Which is why in the essay, the Annoyance or Armageddon essay that Peter cited, I had straightforwardly said, yes, your boss might fire the exceptional person you hired when the crisis is over, and yes, they might fire you. So I'm saying, yes, you're going to have to internalize the cost. I'm not saying, yes, you should have internalized the cost, but whether or not it was, your duty to internalize the cost or not, such as, that's the way the cards have been dealt to us in society. I think so. I would say that the upward potential then is capped by the very mechanistic structure of the bureaucracies and the limited ability of culture, especially company culture, work culture, to accept the taking of personal responsibility, right? Where it's seen as initiating a turf war, essentially, almost always. So I think that limits it a little bit. I think that there is a lot of opportunity for people to ungaslight themselves in a way. So I think there'll be a lot of people who, if they are in an economically privileged position already, will realize that they are unhappy with their job in important ways and will quit and find something else, hopefully something more productive, possibly even decide to create new things. But again, I do have to emphasize this is, a smaller class of society, the class of society that can afford leisure. For most people, if they lose their job right now, they will have to find another job. And this, space for reflection, personal growth, personally driven creation is notably undercut by those circumstances, at least in practice. Like in theory, I think or for particular individuals who are outliers, you can definitely, even under conditions of economic deprivation, achieve such results and find and figure out new ways in which you can deploy your judgment and perhaps find a better hierarchy of judgment to work in than the current one. But I'm just saying, which outcomes I think we'll see or won't see. I also think remote work is unfortunately going to be followed by remote surveillance. So I think what's going to happen is, instead of us allowing workers to work on their own matters at home, what's actually going to happen is everyone's going to accept that if they're working remotely, your boss has spyware installed on your computer, but only during work hours. However, how many jobs have we had where the work hours are perhaps significantly fake? And to stay sane, you have to do some non-work things while plausibly pretending to work. I think that a lot of the jobs in an industrial economy are like this, unfortunately. So the click will then be surveillance will move from the office to your laptop. And most people I know, they use their work laptop for personal stuff too, right? And the observation at home will suddenly be normalized. So that's a negative outcome, and that's more societal than individual. But I hope I answered your question, Daniel.
Yeah, you put some names to my fears. Thank you.
Samo, are you good to stay about 10 minutes after the hour?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Because we had a lot of good questions. So if anyone has to leave, they can leave anytime they want. This will be recorded and posted on YouTube. Yosho, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Oh, sure, thanks. I think, I guess what I want to ask is, what did I put in here? Basically, what do you think about the trend of qualitative, quantitative risk management and safety culture in institutions? I mean, it's paralleled in society as well as safety culture, but it's also prevalent in institutions. Are there similar criticisms between safety culture in society and in institutions?
Well, cultures can have different safety settings, right? Different safety cultures. I think looking at Japan and comparing Japan to Italy or to India or to Britain, you're going to find some very different defaults that pervade all of society. If you have a lost object, the object is notably more likely to be returned. If you are in a public space, mask wearing is completely normal and normalized. I think in the West, if someone's wearing a mask, whether they have a cold or a flu, I'm not here talking about deadly influenza, I'm just talking about everyday ailments, it's considered strange that you're wearing a mask. It's unusual. What do you have to hide? In a lot of East Asian societies, the norm is more like, oh, you're probably sick and you're trying to keep us safe. Or if it's China, it's like, yeah, I know the air pollution is really bad. It causes me breathing problems too. It's fine. So I think in Japan, the air is fairly clean, at least for a Western style industrial society. So I think the people are wearing masks implicitly to protect others. And I think this is culturally understood. Additionally, it's understood that if you see an object this is less good for disease spread. You should not be touching strange things. You don't know where they are. But there's a pro-social element where it routinely happens that children might lose small, completely irrelevant toys in, say, a supermarket or something, and yet these are brought to the lost and found desk. Like that is interesting. It suggests that the belief is that the level of trust is so high that it's worthwhile to bring something to the lost and found, or go check to the lost and found, because both the person seeking for the lost item and the person finding the item, they both believe that they'll do what they're supposed to do, right? So it's worthwhile to go to lost and found versus buying the kid another toy because you have such high expectations of the behavior of your fellow citizens. So I think that's a direct analogy of safety culture. I'm also going to say another thing. When the Fukushima power plant, accident, disaster, you might call it, happened, there were a lot of calls from the elderly who were previously workers at power plants, at nuclear power plants, who volunteered for the hazardous work there. That is a remarkably high level of social conscientiousness. And that's because I think despite all the issues of having a structurally old society, the elderly in Japan are loved and respected, but also they, the elderly themselves, think of the rest of society as their children, their grandchildren, their true responsibility. So the level of overall orientation is, there's a nice mutualism between generations. And I think in the US, unfortunately, the level of mutualism is low. I will say it's higher than people think. There was a lot of, online, there was a lot of negativity about, say, boomers versus millennials, or now Zoomers, Gen Z. But I think no one wants their grandma to die. No one wants their dad to die. So people are trying to do the right thing during the COVID crisis. We don't do as much of the right thing as we could do in Japan, or as perhaps they're doing in Israel, where in Israel what happened was a lot of the very young conscripts, they have a conscript system, people who are 19, who are 20, sometimes I think even teenagers, have been sort of, conscripted and are now working various jobs that are related to keeping spaces sanitary or taking care of the sick, because they themselves, even if they lack the right medical training, are basically, they're going to be fine. They're not going to die. They're not going to be permanently scarred unless they have some particular condition. Like the death rate is really low for people under 20, as is the complication rate from what is known. So that's an inverse, right? In Japan during Fukushima, the elderly volunteer and are used to work in these ways, and the rest of society honors their sacrifice because it's understood that, the reproductive damage comes first from radiation. So if you're exposed to a lot of radiation, your first biggest risk is birth defects for your children. Your second risk is cancer, but cancer takes 5 to 10 years to develop. Okay. Your third risk is super high doses when your teeth start falling out and your hair starts falling out. But these levels of exposure, the elderly are in theory better off for number one, and to a lesser extent, even number two, because the total amount of cut lifespan is going to be 4 or 5 years instead of, say, 40 or 50 years if you develop cancer at different stages in your life. So to be fair, depending on the type of cancer, a younger person might have an easier time surviving chemotherapy and so on. The details and the realities of the particular challenge matter, such as young people's resistance to COVID. If that's not true, then it's foolish to expose basically young adults. But in another way, isn't that like, the openness and the willingness to have young people engage in direct pro-social action, or the elderly engage in direct pro-social action? That is safety culture too. I think in America, it's hyper-individualist. So we're uncomfortable with being like, well, this portion of society by chance or nature has an opportunity to do something good here and perhaps engage in some amount of sacrifice. Do we allow them to do it? I think there's a discomfort of saying, yeah, any particular demographic is now allowed to do this, or even implicitly expected to do this. I think we don't like to think about it in those terms. So these are more one step away from your question, but I think this is the closest I can think of something like safety culture shared to a whole society. But yeah.
Cool. Kalim, you have a question?
Yes, thanks, Peter. Hi, Samo.
Good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you too. When you were talking earlier about the different sorts of authority structures and their transformations and evolutions, I was wondering if you had considered the relationship of those sorts of transformations to any cyclical theories of history or cyclical theories of governance. In particular, the one that came to mind was Ibn Khaldun, but perhaps other cyclical theories like Spengler's. Just curious if you'd given any thought to those sorts of dynamics. Thank you.
Yes. The dynamics I was describing are more organizational than society-wide, but I think there's certainly, there's certainly society-wide cycles. I think the ancient Greek concept of the kyklos is interesting, which was studied both by Polybius and Aristotle, which proposed that the forms of government go in a cycle, right? In Aristotle and Plato's rendition, I think it starts off, there's like, there's monarchy that turns into tyranny, that is overthrown by aristocracy, that turns into oligarchy, that then becomes a democracy, but then ends up being a dysfunctional tyrannical democracy. And then the cycle restarts. You're right back to the setup of a tyranny or a monarchy. This was based on the observation of the dynamics in, hundreds of Greek city-states in their time period, which are, it's an interesting political science experiment, isn't it? Many cities that are all, they're in the business of growing wine, they're in the business of growing olives and, harnessing them for olive oil, they're doing fishing. In a way, it's like a very good control trial. All of these random little Greek city-states all around the Mediterranean having about the same type of economy, but at different stages of political evolution. So I wouldn't dismiss those insights outright. I will say, though, that it's very difficult to distinguish different cyclical theories of history from each other, say Spengler's, right? Because we've only had one history so far, right? We do not have 10 or 50,000 years of recorded history. We only have something like 4,000 or 5,000 years of recorded history. Any sort of cyclical development might just be outside of our view. Any sort of cycle on the 10,000 year timescale. If I evoke some association to the Long Now Foundation, where I also have a position, is not something that we can yet observe. Shorter cycles on about 1,000 years we can observe and we can talk about, but it's harder to get the confounding factors out, right? It's harder to say, well, okay, this society basically transitioned into an extractive mode of production where it continuously undermined, say, its own economic productivity, or continuously undermined its own ability to reproduce the population. It's hard to distinguish that explanation from, well, the climate shifted and the growing season was shorter, right? It's very hard to distinguish those two because those two will usually coincide, right? There'll be natural induced scarcity, and natural induced scarcity will then be followed by additional artificial scarcity. Hope that somewhat answers the questions, Kaleem.
Cool. So maybe we'll sneak in one more. Jason, would you like to read your question?
Sorry, I done unmute there. Can we make a distinction between safety culture versus a culture of responsibility, given that health and safety has become the principal mechanism of infantilization in our society?
Yeah, I think that the point about infantilization through medicalization is interesting. I would also point out that the medicalization of issues is often an authority grab or a power grab. Pretty straightforwardly. There's some extreme examples. Like you saw in the Soviet Union, there used to exist a psychiatric diagnosis called sluggishly progressing schizophrenia. Sluggishly progressing schizophrenia had two symptoms. One was you're questioning the rule of the Communist Party. Number two is you might not yet have any other symptoms of schizophrenia, but will put you under 6-month observation in a psychiatric ward. I'm just going to point out there's a dark beauty to what I just described. Think of how much more elegant that is to get rid of a dissident than, say, putting them in a gulag. You put them in a gulag, they're going to write these tearful, terrible, moving memoirs, and then you're going to martyr them. You declare them schizophrenic. Well, it becomes dubious, right? Someone would be, have you read this interesting samizdat? And someone else has said, oh, I thought he was locked up in the loony bin. And the other person is like, no, the Communist Party caused that to happen. The terrible part about this is, the person might actually be a schizophrenic, right? If you were in, communist Russia 1982 and you're schizophrenic, do you have delusions of persecution from the Communist Party. You might, even though there's real persecution happening. That's an extreme case, however, and mental health is always questionable. So a lot of what I would question in our own society is the overdiagnosis of depression, where what I do believe is there are many people who are feeling miserable and have a lack of meaning in their life. But I believe we tend to pretend that this is some mysterious society-wide mental health crisis, rather than perhaps society has structurally made life ugly and unlivable for significant portions of the population. So the medicalized response is very interesting. It is a response of the authorities to you as an individual, rather than perhaps a response of the authorities with society, or even the authorities with society, right? And another one is medicalization implies you should internalize the costs and listen to someone outside of you, versus, a more creative or collaborative frame where actually you should internalize the costs and you are the ultimate decision maker, or we should externalize some of the costs and decision making is made together, or perhaps at least, you're being told what to do, but you're also not paying the price of what you're being told what to do, right? So you could also have a social contract that goes more in that direction, and that's been attempted by some of those countries. So I think that safety culture versus responsibility culture, I think, you can never have a bureaucratic rule set that covers all details. All functional safety cultures have to be responsibility cultures. Unless you have a bias towards, it is my responsibility, there is no accident here, or there is no disaster here, it will be much too easy for events to slip through where it's no one's responsibility to make it go well. So it's better to have an overly developed sense of responsibility, proactively fix things, and be grateful to others when others proactively fix a problem you were supposed to fix, and have it be that them doing that is not bad for you. That, I think, is the only way to develop a real safety culture, either in an organization or at society at large.
All right. So I think that's a good point to end. I'll make some closing announcements in a moment, but Samo, do you have any closing thoughts? Anything you'd like to leave us with today?
Well, I was very grateful for the thoughtful questions. I think that one of the things that's often neglected is the overlap of the personal emotional life with the social interpersonal life of small scale, with the large institutionalized life in society, right? Things like hospitals, prisons, governments, they shape water cooler conversations, families, church communities. These shape the individual emotional life of people and what motivates them and how they go through life. The full stack of these developments, that's something I really hope we can all think about more and integrate more in our public discourse, rather than chop it up into, mental health or economics or political science or philosophy. If you neatly pack philosophy or political science or economics into its own little box, well, it's very hard to be a live player then, right? Like, we can only have dead players. We can only operate off of narrow recommendations of scripts, rather than pursuing holistic answers.
Right. So I'll make some closing thoughts, announcements in a moment. But Samo, thanks so much for coming on, my friend. That was a lovely chat and some great Q&A. And I was just messaging someone privately in the chat box saying, I love Samo's mind. So I'd love to have you come back in the STOA and do another session. The plug, a couple of events coming up tonight at 7 p.m. Eastern time. We have the Narcissistic Spotlight. So we're doing this artistic kind of therapeutic blur the line between the two experiment to address our narcissism and shine some love on it. One this Friday that might be of interest to this audience, our buddy Patrick Ryan is coming in, Samo, at 8:30 Eastern time about trauma drama. And I'll read the blurb. Patrick Ryan will deliver a presentation on how trauma doesn't just propagate, but also scales and filters. So that turns you on, then RSVP to that on the website. Raven, if you're still in the chat, could you unmute yourself and just talk about the Socratic speed dating that's happening this Friday?
Yeah. Hi, everybody. So I've been doing a recurring
Looks like Raven just froze. Oh, you're back.
Am I back?
Yeah.
You can see me. Hi. My internet connection is unstable, but that's okay. So everyone's invited if you want to have a one-on-one conversation and engage with kind of a series of questions to get some intimate and spontaneous interaction with other people who are coming to the STOA, to the campfire. So you're totally welcome to join us. We'd love to see you.
Great. The STOA is a gift for all of us to freely use in this time of need. If you're inspired to give a gift to the STOA, just go to this website, thestoa.ca/gift, and you can find out more information there. All right. Thanks everyone for coming today.
Thank you again for hosting, Peter. Goodbye.